often pushed to the corners of fantasy dungeons, things like rats or tribes of savage goblins or even the kinds of bandits and raiders that we love in fantasy games get cast to the wayside the second your players start to go out on greater and greater adventures. But I'm here to tell you, my friends, that there's quite a lot that you can do with weaker creatures to make interesting battles. Hello everybody and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. My name is Kyle, I am the Dork, and that makes you fine folks the desk. A couple of things before we get started. We've got a Patreon if you like supporting our content. For $10 a month, you get a unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else. And for $3 a month, you get early access to our content. We think it's a pretty good deal. If you want physical copies of any of the role-playing games that Desks and Dorks makes, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and if you're interested in PDF copies of any of our games, you can get those over at itch.io. That QR code or the link in the description will take you there. With that out of the way, let's talk about what we're going to be discussing. You see, I love weak creatures. It's no secret that I'm a big fan of low fantasy, but I'm also a big secret of high fantasy or fantasy in any of its myriad forms. And I particularly adore weak monsters because I think it makes for more interesting encounter design if you do it right. This was loosely inspired by the 7 Levels of Rapper music video that I saw and I absolutely adored. And in a similar fashion, I'm going to be breaking this down into techniques rather than given creatures, because I think that giving you, GMs and players, a toolbox approach is far more useful than just giving you monsters that plug and chug. Because remember, we don't do stuff just for D&D here, we do this for any fantasy role-playing game, so everything is setting and system agnostic. This means I want to give you tactics and techniques rather than set monsters. And two, on that level, I'm not going to be just pumping up monsters full of steroids and making them more powerful. I think that's A, kind of a cop-out to the sort of thought experiment that we are going to be doing today, and B, I also don't think it gets to the root of why your combat encounters or battles in general might be a little more boring and might be falling a little bit more flat. Remember, interesting doesn't always mean more powerful, and ultimately, before we get started, let's talk about what you do want when you're making a combat encounter of any kind, whether it's with something as lowly as a goblin or something as powerful as a demigod. One, you want an encounter that feels memorable to the players. Now, obviously, what is and isn't memorable is totally and completely subjective within the space of a game. It's not like there's an objective list that we can go through, a rubric of sorts, but you want to do stuff that maybe sticks out from things that you have experienced with your players up to that point that challenges them in a particularly unique way. If you do that, it generally does tend to be memorable. You also want to give your players opportunities to use their abilities in creative or off-the-wall ways. Part of what leads to a memorable or intriguing encounter of any kind is the opportunity that a player gets when they're able to use an ability, a spell, a piece of their background, an artifact, a squirrel that they tied to a megaphone to make another megaphone. There's my obligatory one Dave the Barbarian reference per video. But again, any of those things could make for a more interesting combat encounter, and that's really what you want to be striving for, giving the players an ability to play creatively. And I think that's critical when we're talking about these kinds of things here. Lastly, and this goes along with making sure that your players have creative problem solving and creative solutions, you want them to be able to apply those solutions in off-the-wall ways. And there's really no better example of this in pop culture media, at least not one that I could think of off the top of my head, than the Fastball special. Colossus is really powerful in the X-Men, Wolverine is really small and aerodynamic and really pointy, and that means that we can combine those two things in intriguing ways, and that leads us to the Fastball special. So again, making things that are memorable, that encourage creative problem solving, and allow players to use their abilities in interesting and creative ways are all different aspects and angles that you and I can take as game masters when we are running our role-playing games. And I think it's pretty critical to making the kinds of stuff that's really going to pop. Lastly, before we go to our next part, I want to talk about this. I think that combat should be a puzzle. It's something that the players have to solve, a dynamic sort of equation, if you will, that your players are constantly engaging with. And there's different ways that they're going to engage in that equation. Some of them are going to try to go through it using talking, diplomacy, and roleplay. Some of them are going to try to break the system and the abilities that they are given. And some of them are going to go, big number, good. I hit with stick, good. Yes, stick, good. And all of those approaches are totally and completely valid. Give your players multiple ways to solve the puzzle, but encourage them to engage with it as a problem to be solved rather than a nail waiting to get hammered. And lastly, we're going to be doing this and designing our own interesting encounter through the lens of Rip Scrabblorp. Yes, Rip Scrabblorp, everybody. I liked the way that we did this for the religion video. The link to that should be somewhere if you want to watch that. We built a religion as the video progressed, and so in that spirit, I thought we, together, you and I, would make an interesting encounter around the lowliest of lowly creatures, Rip Scrab... I'm going to get his name wrong so many times. Rip Scrabblorp, the burrowing goblin. And with that out of the way, let's talk about level 1, which is location, location, location. Because just like a really homicidal real estate agent, you have to consider that where you set your encounters and fights and the environments that they take place in is going to have drastic and long-lasting effects on how a battle takes place. At its most basic, location offers an advantage to your players or to the monsters or the antagonists of the encounter. This could be something as simple as high ground, granting like additional bonuses on attack and damage, or allowing rerolls, something along those lines. But really, what I think you should be talking about is location offering a change in tactics. And let's talk about a tribe of orcs and how location might potentially be useful in an orc encounter. At level 1, you vary up the terrain. This is, again, the most basic thing that you can do to make a weak enemy like these lowly orcs a little bit more interesting. On a base level, you could just have the orcs charge at the players on flat ground. This would result in, obviously, a fairly boring and perhaps one-sided fight either way. Either the orcs charge and they overwhelm, or the orcs get bad rolls and the players overwhelm them. It's all kind of straightforward. But if you allow for the orcs to be somewhere on a giant mountaintop or on high ground, suddenly the battle becomes a little bit more interesting, right? You've varied up the terrain. And as a result, now the orcs have options like pushing boulders down at their enemies, throwing javelins, or hurling axes, or, I don't know, even chucking random rocks. There's all kinds of things that you could potentially do to make this far more interesting, and all you've done at this first level is vary up your terrain. But after that, we move to level 2, and that's using location to change how troops, or in our case, monsters, would move about your map. Let's consider the idea that we put those orcs back on the mountain for this particular level. And now we've got a really interesting encounter as opposed to something that the players are just going to traipse through, or there's going to be a single pitched battle that's just a deluge of rolls in this instance. Several of the orcs are posted up under these rope bridges to prevent the party from crossing, and multiple orcs, using those yellow lines as our sightline indicator, are going to rain down fire either with magic or rocks or ranged weapons from height. They get an advantage both in terms of like the rolls themselves, but also in terms of what they can see from the players when they're on that ledge. And in addition to that, one of the things that's going to make this more difficult is the orcs on the bridges will prevent them from going forward. Now, this is a base level of doing this. This is where there are lower levels right now, but this simple idea suddenly makes this encounter a lot more challenging because the players are going to have to engage with it in a way that isn't just I charge forward. Now, our players are going to have to figure out how they're going to approach both the rope bridges and the orcs that are raining down ranged attacks every single turn. At level 3, what you do, however, is you kind of cheat. You combine both of these functions. The idea of varying up the terrain, even within a single encounter, and using that variation in terrain to change how troops move. Let's go back to our example of the orcs and the rope bridges, right? We talked about this before. This was our level 2, but we're going to add some additional stuff to it. We've now added a third layer of ranged defense. You have orc skirmishers on the middle of the bluff, which are attacking there. You have the orc bodyguards up there, and then the final ones that we have added are additional orc ranged combatants who use moving layers of cover, which are indicated by those rectangles, to continue to fight the players. This means that they can shuffle around if the players are going to try to maneuver, so they can continue to get shots off, and the movable barriers act kind of like the old wicker shields of the Greeks and the Macedonians, which I think is pretty cool. The early Bronze Age shields, these are essentially layers of wicker and in some cases leather hide or scale over those shields. They were incredibly light and wide and could act as cool portable cover. And this also means that our orcs now have ways to retreat if things go poorly. So if somebody is to strike at an orc moving on the far right bridge, they can fall back, join the other orc or orcs positioned on the other bridge, and if both of them fail, all of the orcs can continue to funnel backwards to the final path, where they can use their numbers and hopefully the fact that they have worn down the players to their advantage. Essentially, this plays out like a miniature siege, where the players are constantly forcing their way up through layers upon layers of ranged attacks. The orcs are continuing to fall back into more and more defensible positions using their numbers and the fact that they've been able to chip away at the party to their advantage. All of this comes together as a combination, and it's what really makes this, I think, the perfect version of a level 3. But ultimately, though, you as a game master need to be considering, how does this offer problem solving? And there's a couple ways that this could potentially work. Maybe your players are more melee focused. They like going in sword and board or hammer and nail, and they like to just, charge forward, battling everything out. Maybe they leave after being rebuffed by the orcs and realize they have to change up their tactics, so they all come back with ranged weapons and portable cover of their own. Perhaps the players set off an explosion or a similar distraction to draw the attention of the ranged orcs, while, indicated by the blue line, the players have already scaled around the other side of the cliff, scaled up the rocks, and ambushed the orc ranged combatants from behind, collapsing the entire strategy in on them. Or maybe your players need to go out into the world and meet people or things that help them. This is where the world building that you as a game master have done comes into play, or where creating interesting NPCs can offer a cool opportunity during a quote-unquote weaker encounter. Perhaps the players have done a couple favors for the town alchemist or for the strange hermit living in the woods who has all of those odd chemicals, and maybe it's this character that gives them the necessary combustibles to create the explosion that becomes their distraction. Or perhaps he gives them something a little more exotic, a kind of medieval version of Greek fire, to either distract or force the orcs away from those defensive positions and embankments. Or maybe the players make friends with the yeoman who kept roaming around the wilderness in his youth and has now since retired, and even though he no longer goes exploring and spelunking, his climbing tools could be of great use to the party as they attempt to scale the canyon. All of these are ways that your players could approach this problem, which is what makes this an ideal level 3. If you do nothing else to make an interesting encounter out of a weaker encounter, I would highly encourage you to use the terrain and vary it up, even within that single location, and vary those tactics because of it. I'm going to, again, just go back to our original. If you look at that terrain, one of the cool parts is we have the bridges for choke points, we have moving layers of protection for the orcs, and we have skirmishers in the middle of the ridge. So you can see that we've really varied up our terrain 3 times in one encounter. All of this goes a long way to making games that are engaging, enjoyable, and ultimately fun, even if you're using a weak monster. The watchword here is that you want to make sure that there are asymmetric solutions to the problems that you've given your players. You don't want them walking around using a sword as a hammer and thinking every monster is a nail. It's not really something that's going to make it engaging. So again, think about how you can vary up the location that you play on. And speaking of varying up the location, we return to our pal Rip Scrablorp and his entire battle. Now, Rip Scrablorp was part of a tribe of burrowing goblins that were taken out during a raid on a village. The villagers rejoiced, having vanquished their foes, but they failed to notice that one of the goblins was not nearly as deceased as they were hoping for. No, Rip Scrablorp is not unalived. He remains. And Rip Scrablorp, being the, shall we say, inventive, adaptive, intriguing goblin that he is, burrows under an abandoned shack on the edge of town, indicated by that red dot right there. Now, already, as a game master, how can we turn the town into an interesting location for a battle? Well, let's talk about Rip a little bit more, right? We've mentioned he's a burrowing goblin, and so gradually he starts to create a series of tunnels venturing out from this abandoned shack. He makes one at a copse of trees just out of the way of the town. He makes another that leads right into the riverbank in case he needs to make a quick escape. This means that Rip is already starting to mark out his potential terrain. He knows he can't flee, and he also wants a little bit of revenge, so he's starting to build a network. Over time, using animal blood and, taking care of a couple stray cats and dogs and using sort of other tricks to make sounds, he manages to convince some of the population that that abandoned shack is haunted, or at the very least cursed, allowing him to work in secret. Over time, he manages to steal rope from a couple of the buildings, including the abandoned shack that he was in, to build a series of winches and cables using old barrel lids and scraps of recovered wood. Over time, he's able to pull himself along those shafts very quickly, and given enough time, Rip is able to make not just a series of tunnels, but a series of places in the village where he can burst out from underneath the ground with very little difficulty. And what you'll notice is that most of these are placed either near houses or along the edge of the village, so that way that Rip can go and strike with impunity and then disappear, pulling himself through those tunnels along those winches and sleds very, very quickly. Again, all I'm doing is thinking about a problem, right? In our case, how is a goblin supposed to strike out of nowhere in this abandoned village very quickly? We'll use that tunnel system, and making it interesting, because if the players ever do discover Rip, they're going to have to go through those tunnel systems, and that's going to make for a very, very intriguing battle indeed. And speaking of intriguing, I am going to give a shout out, of course, to today's sponsor, our friends from Tales from Elsewhere. Their 100% human-made Weird West game is officially funded. It's like one of the coolest things that I can say. It's 100% human-made, and it's 100% funded. It's one of my favorite games that I've taken a look at. I love the fact that you get to take use of, or at least grab, really, the things that make your character, or would make your character weaker in other settings, and make them a part of your story, both in role-playing and giving you opportunities to sort of manipulate the system. It is a wonderful, evocative, and flavorfully done game, and I gotta tell you, as always, I don't usually use sponsorships in these segments. I have to try the product, I have to know the team, and if I'm lucky, both the product and the team themselves are absolutely amazing, and in this case, they absolutely are. I can give it no greater praise than I actually bought the game. I am one of the backers for this Kickstarter campaign, so I am quite literally putting my money where my mouth is. If you love Weird West games, if you love very easy to learn and play role-playing games, go check out our sponsor in the description below. And again, a huge thank you and shout out to Tales from Elsewhere for, sponsoring this video. Thanks, guys. And with that out of the way, let's return to our next level. And all of these ones for this level moving forward fall under the moniker of fighting dirty. Yes, the purview of thieves, cutthroats, hitmen, and individuals caught in their first street fight, or kindergartners who really want your juice box. Yes, we're talking all about fighting dirty, and that means that we, as GMs, are going to engage in some subterfuge. I want to offer a word of caution, however. Subterfuge is all well and good, but you want to make sure that your players never feel cheated. These should be things that make sense, and they should be things that your players could be like, oh yeah, why didn't I think of that? If the reaction is, oh, why didn't I think of that, as opposed to, oh, well, that seems like random garbage, then you've got them. Because the second they realize I can do the same thing, you're going to have some far more interesting combat encounters. And just like good old caravan raids and good old bandits, level 4 means striking when you're vulnerable and preventing yourself from being struck. Now, here's a couple different ways that you can do this. Your monsters or your encounter could take place at a time when the party is vulnerable. Perhaps they're sleeping, or perhaps inclement weather has rendered their usual defensive positions totally and completely untenable. Or, like a good ambush, maybe your monsters and foes have cut off both signs of ingress and egress from the area, and then they press in on both sides, taking out weaker figures as they go. A simple ambush is a great example of fighting dirty. However, I don't think it's a true level 4 technique until the ambushing party has made it impossible or difficult for your players to escape. That's when it gets really, really hairy. And sure, maybe these are a horde of weaker enemies or a host of weak foes, but if a couple things go poorly for your characters and a couple things go badly, all of a sudden you try to make for the exit only to find that it's barred, or a log is in the way, or, that guide that you met in town that warned you, hey, all of the roads have been flooded out. You've got to be really careful. When your players remember that during that encounter, it's going to have an impact. But one of the things that I don't think people do enough in level 4 is enemies, monsters, foes that want to ambush don't want to get hit. I will quote a good Marine friend of mine who once said, if you ever find yourself in a fair fight, shoot your tactician. Now, I'm not saying you should do that, but your monsters don't want to play fair. Use things like caltrops or spikes, trenches, or in this case, a bristling amount of defensive embankments to prevent the players from having easy access to your monsters. I already mentioned those sort of mobile shields that we used for our orcs a little bit earlier. Take that to the extreme if you're trying to inform or use this level 4 technique. Sharpen some stakes, dig some pits and trenches, throw some caltrops everywhere, and have the players engage with a literal Rube Goldberg machine of ancient medieval style minefields. If it feels like Home Alone, but with more orcs and goblins, you're probably doing it right. And one more thing, by the way, before we jump to our level 5, which is prioritize and isolate, you can use trenches, spikes, and pits to funnel the players where you want to go. That's particularly devious as well. At level 5, though, we prioritize and we isolate. If you're a big fan of Napoleonic tactics or even modern military tactics, you might be familiar with how sharpshooters work. In many wars and many conflicts, what sharpshooters would do is they would prioritize their targets. Even in crowded units, they would go for commanding officers in some cases, or we have reports of individuals in things like the Napoleonic Wars who would go after the sergeants, the mid-level officers, so that it would dissolve the chain of command and chaos would happen. If your monsters are intelligent, they will have a level of priority to what they do. This could be something as simple as, the ogre has learned that older, frail-looking folks in robes are probably magic users, so it goes for them first. Or you want to find wounded or injured targets and take them out, or targets with high priority treasure get taken out first. Creating a simple priority list like this goes a long way to making weak monsters feel a lot more impactful, particularly if you're relying on an individual character with a certain set of abilities to get you through an encounter, and the monster takes them down immediately. It's one thing going into a battle knowing your wizard can shoot fireball. It's another thing when that wizard that was going to shoot fireball gets dragged by their robes off of a ledge, kicking and screaming into the abyss as the sound of thousands of chittering laughs echo around you in the cavern. That's a really terrifying thing, no matter what system or what game you're playing. Ultimately, if you want to look at a great example of this, Gloomhaven has a pretty cool, shall we say, automated monster system where monsters have individual abilities, but certain monsters have certain priorities, usually going after the nearest character or the most heavily wounded character, or in some fan-made scenarios, going after certain characters of certain types. I think it's a cool thing for you to look at as a GM, and even though it exists outside of the realm of traditional role-playing games, you should look at Gloomhaven's system. I think it would probably do a lot to spark some creative ideas. Next, we get to level 6, which is target, tail, and take down. See, an ambush is all well and good, but it lacks the certain, I don't know, je ne sais quoi, a certain personal touch. Yet level 6, the monsters, even though they might be weak, are willing to engage in a little bit of skullduggery, a little bit of cloak and dagger. They're going to tail your players. They're going to follow your players into their places of employment, the places that they rest, and they're not going to engage. They're going to watch, they're going to take notes, and they're going to learn. They're going to figure out what your player likes to do for fun, what your character likes to drink, what your character likes to rest. And eventually, when the character's guards are let down, when they have their worst moment or the best opportunity for those monsters, that's when they're going to strike. The purpose of these missions is to give the characters in your game an understanding of player tactics, a knowledge of player abilities, a feel for party dynamics, and an understanding of the player resources. You want to make sure that you do this in-game with those characters because you want your players to know this isn't you as the game master taking advantage of all of their systems. This is the monsters enacting a carefully calculated plan that takes place over a period of weeks and using it to their best advantage. This actually, I think, works best if you drop little breadcrumbs throughout that the players are being watched or followed. A small strip of fabric going into a back alley, a sound that you're not familiar with in the inn that you're like, might have been nothing, right? It's a creaking floorboard at a night when everybody's partying. Could be anything, right? Small items going missing, or perhaps just simply being moved as the enemy takes stock. One of the other things you could do potentially is throw lesser minion monsters in the way. Like say the goblin tribe has a couple extra goblin prisoners from a raid, enemies from a previous tribe that they've just are going to, quote unquote, initiate into theirs, and they throw those new goblins at the players just to get a feel for what the party is capable of. That is a great way to gather information. And at level 6, your monsters, weak though they may be in ability and power, they're going to be rich with information, knowledge, and foresight. It should feel a little bit like medieval Batman in that case. And again, there is nothing scarier than a group of people with knowledge, planning, and the will to enact it, particularly when they can hide in your environment. Now we return to our good friend Rip Scrabbleblorp. Rip Scrablorp. I'm adding a Rip Scrablorp mispronunciation clowner to this. This is count number 2, by the way. Now, in this case, our buddy Rip has actually expanded his enterprise and is engaging in a little bit of subterfuge of his own. Using those mine shafts that he's dug out from under the town, he's actually decided to engage in a little bit of defenses. He's placed scraps of wood, sharp stones, and other accoutrement all over the place, including breeding venomous centipedes along his path. This means that players, even if they venture down into the tunnels, are going to be waylaid by poisonous bugs, sharp objects, and it's going to make movement incredibly difficult, especially because old Rip has that rope harness that he's designed to let him slide through at a much, much quicker pace. Again, this is part of a person at level 6 is trying to prevent themselves from being attacked, but it goes deeper than that. Because not only has he designed that, he's also made it so that at a moment's notice he can tug and cave in one of the tunnels or parts of the tunnels, potentially taking out a character entirely, having them either suffocated or crushed under stone. Now, adding to this, however, is now Rip is beginning to engage in that skullduggery we talked about earlier. He's popping out from under his tunnels. He's stolen one of the merchant's manifests and is using that to plan his raids. See, these guys are planning for caravans full of goods and gold and all manner of sundry things, and Rip says, I don't want to raid them while they're in town. No. I'll wait and strike them in their warehouses after they think the danger has passed and the goods are already stacked. Several of Rip's red tunnel dots are actually going to be in areas where the merchants stock their goods. So the merchants are expecting banditry on the roads, not banditry when they're in town and they think they're safe. Quote unquote safe. Now, this finally gets us to level 7, which is giving us a personality beyond combat. Now, I'm not saying you need to do this for every single adventure, for every single creature, character, monster, what have you. What I am saying is if you really want to make a weak enemy pop, you have to give them a personality. Let's say our old pal Rip Scrablorp over here is, over the course of his stay in town, has become a big fan of the old brewski, the old beverage, the old age-appropriate drink, and as a result has taken to stealing from the tavern, not because it's strategically viable, but because he's a thirsty boy and Buffalo Wild Wings doesn't exist just yet, right? So instead, maybe what you're going to do is you realize, certain ales and meads go missing. What if we were to flood one of his cavern areas with beer? Would he potentially want to jump in? Or would he be so incensed that so much of his favorite drink has been wasted, it will draw him out? What if Rip has developed a love for the local orphans at the local orphanage, or for the children of veterans who never came back from periods of warfare? What if Rip, despite all of his horrible things, acts like a kind of messed up Santa Claus, using some of his ill-gotten gains to buy these kids the things they need? Are your players willing to use those kids as bait? Or perhaps if they're a little better, a little nicer, are those players willing to build a relationship with those kids in order to potentially build a relationship with an antagonist and maybe turn them into something a little bit neutral? Ultimately, level 7 is up to you as the GM and the storyteller of your games. But I genuinely find that creating a character with these sort of human foibles, these things that exist outside of combat, these motivations, is something that often gets overlooked when we as the game masters just go, hey, how do I make the combat more interesting? I am far more interested in this weird tunnel-dwelling version of Goblin Batman who is addicted to mead and cares about the 6 orphans in town. That's going to lead to some interesting role-playing elements and potentially some interesting ways for your players to make combat go for them, or just to try to survive another day against the goblin whose name I can barely pronounce. And with that, my dear friends, that brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please, consider giving our Patreon a little subscribe-a-rooski. $10 a month, again, gets you a unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else. And if you want physical copies of our games, Tabletop Bookshelf and Indie Press Revolution are the places to grab them. And of course, digital copies can be found right on over at itch.io. But until next time, I have to give a massive thank you to my Patreon backers, Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Corbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mayer, Darth, Gaming Gamison, Ro.kn, Commander Unidentified, Arcane Bard, Stefan Brousseau, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Michael Torres, David Z, and Talath. You are all absolutely awesome. And as always, my friends, I'm Kyle for Desks and Dorks. You've been absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.